Hi, everyone. Welcome to our event on research on the employability of English-speaking Quebecers. I'm Lorraine O'Donnell of the Quebec English-Speaking Communities Research Network, QUESCREN. I'll start with our territorial acknowledgement. I acknowledge that while we meet today on a virtual platform, Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodian of these lands and waters. Montreal is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Each presenter will give a presentation of 10 minutes, followed by a share Q&A session. And we've asked presenters to stick to the allotted time. Thank you. I would like to thank our sponsors, the Secretariat aux relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise, the Department of Canadian Heritage, and the Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities. I would also like to welcome some people in the audience. We have people from the Office of the Commissioner of Official Languages, and also some people from the Senate of Canada, the Official Languages Committee. So I welcome them today to our event. I now pass you over to our moderator, Dr. Danielle Salée, from the School of Community and Public Affairs at Concordia University. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, Lorraine. Bonjour à tout le monde. Merci de m'avoir demandé de modérer de présider cette séance. I'm very glad for this, because in particular, the whole question of employment of English speakers in Quebec Public Service is something that has been ongoing for me, at least. I came to Concordia back in the mid-1980s at the Department of Political Science, and we, at the time, just had organized, in fact, set up a master's in public policy and public administration, which with the very specific goal of precisely helping Anglophones to access the Quebec Public Service. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out to be that way. Eventually, with time, students would go more towards the federal public service. We had internships, and the internships were more attractive, I guess, in the federal public service. And over the years, we didn't get that many English speakers to go and work in the Quebec Public Service. So obviously, it's a very important and very significant topic that needs to be addressed. So I'm glad to be able to moderate this discussion. And our first presenter, we have 5 presenters. I will present them, I will introduce them as we go along. As Lorraine said, they'll have each 10 minutes, and then at the end, we'll have a Q&A. I'm quite glad as well, because this is almost like a family reunion. Lorraine is an adjunct professor at the School of Community and Public Affairs, where I'm the principal. Christopher Skeete, who will be speaking in a minute, is also a former student of the School of Community and Public Affairs, and Celine Cooper, one of our speakers as well, has been teaching at the School of Community and Public Affairs in the past few years as a part-time teacher. So I'm very glad that we're all together here. And as I said, it's like a family reunion. So without further ado, I would ask Christopher Skeete to make the opening remarks. Christopher Skeete is the M&A for St. Rose. He's also the parliamentary assistant to the Premier for Relations with English-speaking Quebecers. And also, more recently, is also the parliamentary assistant to Ms. Benoit Charette, who's also in charge, as you have found out, probably in the news in the past weeks, was in charge of the fight against racism in Quebec. Mr. Skeete, please.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. Salée. Thank you very much for having me. Always a pleasure to see old family members together around the same table, especially talking about a very important issue. I'm going to speak to you quickly about what the role of the Secretariat is, and then I'd like to talk a little bit more about what we're doing in terms of employability. I'm going to be speaking in English and French, so please feel free at any time during the chat, if ever you'd like to ask me questions about what I said, I'll be happy to take a look at that. Le rôle du secrétariat vise à favoriser la participation des Québécois d'expression anglaise à la vie sociale, économique et culturelle du Québec. Concrètement, on veut créer des partenariats entre les organismes communautaires et le gouvernement. Pour y arriver, ce qu'on fait, c'est qu'on rencontre les différents ministères afin de les informer des différentes situations que peuvent vivre les Québécois d'expression anglaise. Et donc, le secrétariat a un rôle d'être la source d'informations fiable sur les réalités et les besoins de la communauté d'expression anglaise. Et le but ultime, c'est de partager ces connaissances-là avec l'ensemble du gouvernement dans le but de faire avancer les intérêts des Québécois d'expression anglaise. C'est un outil d'écoute, c'est aussi un outil qui parle à l'intérieur de lui-même, l'entité gouvernementale, dans le but de faire avancer tous les intérêts qui sont communs à la communauté. Recently, we had some statistics that we shared with the Minister for Employability, my colleague, Jean Boulet. I remember at the time, before the pandemic, almost a half century ago, or so it seems like, we were talking about the shortages in the labor force. And I remember after speaking with Bill Floch, whom you'll meet later on, we were discussing how there's an employability gap between the English-speaking Quebecers and Francophones, and this in a time when we actually are having problem recruiting qualified individuals. And that struck me as something that was very, quite frankly, absurd, that we had 12,000 extra English-speaking Quebecers that were not able to achieve status in the workforce at the same time that we were looking at importing labor. So that prompted Jean Boulet to be very concerned. I remember he was very surprised by that statistic, a 3% gap in employability. And when I told him that, he said, well, why don't we create a committee? Why don't we create a ministerial consultative board together where we can address these issues and address the particular issue of access to employment for English-speaking Quebecers. And he made that announcement at the first launching of the PERT, the Roundtable on November 22nd, 2019. And one of the things that he committed to at that moment was to keep an eye on this indicator. And one of the things that I did around that time was also go around Quebec to meet with various community groups, or about 150 in all community groups that we met throughout Quebec, 8 in-person meetings in the regions and 3 sectoral meetings that we did. We came across that, the fact that this was an ongoing issue. And there's a lot of reasons for that issue, but really what we wanted to do is find a concrete way of addressing it, which is why in the last provincial budget, the CAQ government allotted $1.4 million per year for 5 years in order to fund this employability initiative. And that's something that I'm very proud of, because I think it's going to help us really close that gap that exists between the English-speaking community and the Francophone majority. We should also know that there's a lot of issues surrounding that employability gap. For instance, Dr. Salée before was talking about how the SCPA program tended to fuel candidates and graduates toward the federal government. I myself followed that path. I went straight from the SCPA to the federal government, and it never even dawned on me that the Quebec civil service could be a place for me. So I think we have to change that. I think we have to change this reflex that Quebecers have that somehow certain places are not for them. Let me give you an example of what I mean when I say that. When we spontaneously think of, let's go work for a bank, right? English-speaking Quebecers, well, we end up at the RBC and BMO and Scotia and TD. Very few of us end up at National Bank and Desjardins, right? So there's kind of like an undertone of a sense of belonging that's lacking, that says that certain institutions are not for us. My secretariat, if we're successful, is to help Quebecers realize that that's their flag and that they belong in every aspect of Quebec society. And I think when we take employability issues seriously, we're going to be able to break down those barriers. So
Mr. Skeete, if I may, sorry to interrupt you, I'm told you should speak a little slower.
Yeah.
The translation.
Poor thing. I know it's yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, so it's because I'm trying to squeeze in a year's worth of work in 10 minutes, Dr. Salée, but I'll do better. Another thing that we realized quickly when we did our consultation was that a significant gap exists with regards to English-speaking communities' ability to communicate in French. Now, we do a very good job of teaching how to speak French. I think a lot of us are very bilingual. We're able to communicate and express ourselves in French, but there's a gap when it comes to the French written. And of course, we all know that the data suggests, and data supplied by QUESCREN, entre autres, tells us that when you haven't spoken the language, or if you haven't practiced the language after a couple of years, let's say when you leave CEGEP or university, you tend to lose your abilities in French and sort of fall under what is considered a functional amount of French. So one of the things that we're looking at now is how to help English-speaking Quebecers maintain, keep, and improve their French. Because let's face it, the English-speaking Quebecers who didn't leave Quebec during the tumultuous times of the Quiet Revolution and the passage of Bill 101 and the first election of the PQ, those who chose Quebec today are those who want to stay here, and they fully recognize that to be successful, they have to master French. And that brings me to another issue that I think is very important for our consideration. Is one of the things that we discovered in terms of employability was how do we stop this brain drain towards other provinces or to the US? And again, we realized that if we can, attack the indicator of having specific policies for the English community that bridges the gap, so PERT is an answer to that issue, and on the other side, improve the functionality in French, we should have some really good results. And you should know that one of the things that's on my priority list is to look at the civil service. And there's a really good overlap with a recent role that I got by the Premier to be the parliamentary assistant to the minister responsible for fighting racism. Of course, we know the Quebec civil service also has issues with having visible minorities participating in government work. So there's a really nice synergy and a crescendo that's bringing us to looking at how we're doing employability in general in the civil service. And I will be making sure that we take a look at all those indicators as well to see how we can move that needle. So needless to say, the Quebec government is very active right now in trying to address some of the issues, some of the irritants that exist in the English community in terms of having access to various things, notably employment. And I think that's the best vector for integration. So these are all things that we're working on together in the hopes of getting that done. Now, of course, we've been a little bit slowed down by the pandemic. Of course, I would have preferred seeing you all in person and seeing Dr. Salée and shaking his hand. I think I haven't seen him in over 15 years. It would have been really nice to be with you, but meeting virtually, I think, is still very important to build this relationship. And I'm hopeful that you guys have a great session. And I will try to stay on board. I'm not sure if I'll be able to cancel my 1 o'clock meeting so I can participate in the panel, but I will stay tuned. And hopefully you guys will have a great panel, and know that if ever you have any questions, my office is always available to address them or help you guys or guide you guys in any way. So thanks for having me, and enjoy the session.
Thank you very much, Mr. Skeete. You stayed within your time, even better. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Celine Cooper. Celine is the Managing Director of the Consortium of English Language CEGEPs, colleges, and universities of Quebec. But more importantly, with respect to our today's session, she's also one of the co-authors of QUESCREN document that was published about 1.5 years ago called Employment of English Speakers in Quebec's Public Service. Ms. Cooper is going to talk about this document, among other things. Celine?
Thank you, Dr. Salée. Again, my name is Celine Cooper, and I am the Managing Director of the Consortium of English Language CEGEPs, Colleges and Universities, which is based at Bishop's University. Today, I'm going to share some of the findings and observations from a 2019 working paper in which myself, Patrick Donovan, and Lorraine O'Donnell at QUESCREN explored the participation of English speakers in Quebec's public service. And this research was commissioned by the Secretariat for Relations with English-speaking Quebecers. This is what I plan to cover today. I'll just move this out of the way here. So this is what I plan to cover in the next 10 minutes or so. So the baseline research for this study was essentially a literature review. I also consulted with 16 well-placed individuals in the fields of government, public administration, political life, academia, university administration, the media, and the community sector to provide an additional layer of data for this working paper. I'd also like to take a minute here to clarify who it is that we're talking about. So as many of you know, there are different ways of counting or defining minority language communities in Canada. English-speaking community organizations in this province have tended to favor the federal government definition, first official languages spoken, or FOLS, in part because it is a broader definition. The Quebec government has traditionally used the mother tongue definition and the term Anglophone in reference to English-speaking Quebecers. So Anglophone in this case means someone for whom English is their first language learned and still understood. So statistics from the Government of Quebec in this report, what I'll be presenting today, reflect this definition. So let's start here today with a fact, and that fact is that English-speaking Quebecers have long been underrepresented in Quebec's public service. This is something that's been well documented and flagged as a matter of concern for decades, most notably in discussions around minority language community vitality and well-being, but also in terms of broader employment equity measures within the Quebec public service. A key takeaway from our study was that the proportion of mother tongue English-speaking Quebecers in Quebec's public service has hovered around 1% since the early 1970s. And to give you a sense of the proportions, mother tongue English-speaking Quebecers represent approximately 8 to 9% of the total population of this province. So that's a clear underrepresentation. This is just a visual representation with some stats drawn from the Treasury Board on programs and measures for access to equal employment. And so as you can see from figure 2 on the right, one of the interesting things to note is that the public service has been a bit more successful in increasing the number of quote unquote cultural communities within its ranks. So cultural communities here include non-white visible minorities, regardless of mother tongue, and those with a mother tongue other than English or French. Indigenous populations are not included in this category. The figure on your left, figure 1, here shows the differences between mother tongue English speakers in the public service and the total population of Quebec. So you'll see that it stays around 1%. That's the line in blue at the bottom. Since the early 1980s, the Quebec government has taken measures to increase the participation of English speakers in the Quebec public service. So I could have filled up 3 or 4 slides with the various measures that have been introduced over the last 40 years, but instead I've included a few highlights here in this one very cluttered slide. Ultimately, what we learned in our research was that there has been a number of initiatives to implement equal access employment programs, and in some cases to address accusations of hiring discrimination. The government has taken measures over the years to boost representation of minority groups, including women, people with disabilities, visible minorities, members of cultural communities, Indigenous peoples. Sometimes Anglophones are mentioned and sometimes they're not. The last few years, of course, have seen a few significant developments. In 2017, the Secretariat for Relations with English-speaking Quebecers was created within the Ministère du Conseil Exécutif, and they're here with us today, obviously, which is great. In 2018, the Treasury Board released its strategy from 2018 to 2023, which includes its latest program that aims to achieve 25% hiring of members of target groups within the regular, casual student and intern staff. These target groups are members of cultural communities, Indigenous peoples, Anglophones, as well as people with disabilities. The takeaway here is that the underrepresentation of English speakers within Quebec's public service and in political nominations has been identified and acknowledged as a policy problem by successive governments from all political stripes across the spectrum for over 40 years. Despite that, the needle for English speakers hasn't moved. So why does this matter? English-speaking Quebecers have high levels of education, yes, but they also register higher levels of unemployment than Francophones. They have lower median incomes and are proportionately more likely to live below the low-income cutoff line. There's still an impression out there that we're dealing with a very wealthy Anglophone elite, but the facts don't bear that out. In 2017 to 2018, the Quebec Public Service was made up of just under 60,000 people working in some 20 departments and 65 agencies throughout the province. That's a lot of really good jobs that English speakers are not accessing. I'll move now to some of the findings and observations from our study. What we did was group the data that we gathered from respondents and the literature into the themes that you see here. Short-term solutions to a perennial issue. So as mentioned earlier, the underrepresentation of English-speaking Quebecers within the public service and in political nominations has been very well documented. It's been acknowledged as a problem by the provincial government. The government has tended to address this problem through short-term and one-off initiatives. So we believe that a more thorough policy approach is required to address this problem. Further research could shed light on the causes and effects of this situation and help to propose some durable solutions. Part of this would involve assessing strategies that have been applied elsewhere or for other minorities. Lack of specific employment equity measures targeting English-speaking Quebecers. So while there's been a systematic acknowledgement and some effort to redress the underrepresentation of ethnic, cultural, and visible minority populations in Quebec's public service, there currently exists no specific plan of action when it comes to—
2 minutes, Celine.
Okay.
2 minutes.
I'm going. When it comes to equity and increasing participation of English speakers in the public service. So one respondent that I spoke with referred to it as a definition issue, emphasizing that sometimes measures around equity include Anglophones and other minority groups, and sometimes they don't. So we're lacking an intersectional analysis. It was also noted that this definition was addressed by the task force, a report on the full participation of Black communities in Quebec society, chaired by Yolande James in 2006, I believe. So this isn't a new issue. We know that this exists. So we think that a more systematic effort to create employment equity measures targeting English-speaking Quebecers with clear goals, benchmarks, integration measures, and budgets attached would be required to really address this, this underrepresentation. The need to stimulate interest among youth in provincial affairs and build employment pathways to the Quebec public service. Several respondents in the university and political sectors that I spoke with talked of a tendency for English-speaking Quebecers interested in public service jobs to look at federal rather than provincial opportunities. And both Dr. Salée and Mr. Skeete mentioned this in your opening remarks. English-speaking youth, even those born and raised in the province, do not always see opportunities and career prospects for themselves in the public service or in the province's political life. Respondents suggested that this orientation to Ottawa might also be reinforced by a tendency of programs and with internship components at universities that serve Quebec's English-speaking community to focus their curriculum on the federal government and not the provincial government. And as an educator at SCPI, I was guilty of this as well. So what we did as the researchers, we looked at the statistics of applicants to public service competitions from the late 80s and 90s, and they corroborate this idea that there is an orientation to Ottawa tendency among English-speaking Quebecers. We think that more quantitative and qualitative research is needed to determine whether or not this tendency is continuing into the 21st century, especially in the wake of recent efforts to target English-speaking Quebecers. We also think that it would be useful to have more statistics that use the broader definition of English speakers, so the FOLS, the first official language spoken, rather than the narrower one of mother tongue. And we also would like to know a little bit more about this apparent reticence on the part of students and universities. So is it that there's a lack of interest in Quebec? Is there a sense of resignation that maybe it's just not worth applying? Or is it something else? And I'll end on this one small note, this need for more public service jobs with high concentrations of English speakers. So some of the people that we spoke to, you know, in terms of kind of anecdotal information, they noted that many English speaking job seekers were reluctant to relocate to Quebec City, where most of the provincial public service jobs are located. Because there was a sense that the city has fewer English language, cultural, and social resources. So we think we need more research to determine whether creating more public sector jobs where English speakers currently live, like Montreal, in this region, would facilitate recruitment. It's worth pointing out that the representation of English speakers in the public service is low even in regions where English speakers are more numerous, like Montreal. So the proportion of mother tongue English speakers in public service jobs in Montreal has just traditionally hovered at around 1%. And this is my final point. I'll end by saying that this study was never meant to be exhaustive or conclusive. It was really meant to jumpstart or re-jumpstart the conversation around the participation of English speakers in Quebec's public service and to highlight the fact that there is still much work to be done. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to the other speakers.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cooper. We have over 80 participants in this webinar, so obviously there is a definite interest in the work that you have done. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Mr. Douglas Brown, who is the Dean of Technologies and the Dean of Career Programs at John Abbott College. Mr. Brown?
Hello, I'm just opening up everything. I assume you can hear me. So John Abbott carried out 3 substantial but complementary research projects between 2017 and 2020 involving health and social services programs, first at Abbott and then at the 6 English language colleges with such programs. I'm going to review some of the results of 2 of those projects briefly, and then review the results and data from the third in somewhat more detail. Now, the reports from those projects come to a total of almost 185 pages, so it's very difficult to summarize this in 10 minutes. First, we did a survey of Abbott's health and social services programs to gauge how open students were to establishing themselves after graduation in regions of Quebec other than Montreal. All 3 of our studies had to do with retention of students in Quebec, and in particular, retention of students in regions of Quebec, as I say, other than Montreal. So some of our key findings from that initial study were that student openness to working in regions was greater than anticipated, but varied considerably by program. We found that student openness was correlated to self-reported confidence in French, which also varied significantly by program. We also found that confidence in students' French in these health and social services programs, which lead directly to employment, tended to be lower than in 2-year pre-university programs. All right, so a key recommendation from that initial study had to do with finding internal and external resources for students who need support in order to enhance their written and spoken French. And our sense is that this will be an ongoing need for those students. Now, in terms of what you can see on this screen, that is from the third study. You can look at it so you get a sense of the sorts of things I'll be talking about, because there is a lot of information on those slides. Our second study, which we did from 2018 to 2020, involved faculty from 13 different programs in the 6 English colleges. That is a total of 19 individual programs, because there is some repetition of programs from college to college. And we sought to assess the potential for internship placements in regions of Quebec other than Montreal in order to encourage graduates from both the regional and the Montreal colleges to establish themselves in those regions. And some key findings from that study were that interest and enthusiasm for developing regional internships was high among faculty, but that there are logistical issues related to transportation, lodging, supervision, and so on that would require sustained funding from external bodies. Another finding is that there's an opportunity, even a critical need perhaps, to support Indigenous people and communities that use English as their first official language in Quebec through support for English colleges internships in programs like youth and adult correctional intervention and dental hygiene. Based on some success stories, we can say that supporting regional internships works in terms of educational, community, and eventual employment outcomes. Now, of the programs we studied, it has made strategic sense to prioritize the nursing programs, and we are consequently following up with the clinical coordinator of hospital placements for Dawson, John Abbott, and Vanier to develop a regional internship pilot for nursing programs over the next few years. And finally, it's clear that anyone who is interested in working with the college programs needs to realize that initiatives to address regional or metropolitan employment of graduates will go nowhere without the buy-in and input of the teachers and staff who are doing the administrative and educational work on the ground. Now, I'll turn to our third research project, and the slide you see, which is figure 39 from a quite lengthy report, looked at the factors that influence the retention of students in Quebec, including their potential for living in regions other than Montreal. And again, we're looking at health and social services programs. So in 2019 and 2020, we conducted surveys of 4,058 students, of which 2,439 responded for a response rate of 60%. So this was a substantial study. 40% of the respondents were from nursing programs, 30% from other health programs, 30% from social service programs. 74% of the respondents are from Montreal, the census Montreal area, and 24% from other regions of Quebec, with a small remainder being from outside Quebec. And here
so
are some.
Doug, your screen is being shared, so you can move the slides, or
Okay.
Anna can move them for you.
Well, that's good. I have just tried to move it, and there we go. Well, so here are some of our findings. 68% of the respondents had English as their main language, 18% French, 14% another language. Program offerings are an important factor in the choice of an English college, with Francophones identifying the opportunity to study in English as a significant motivator. Students from the regions are most likely to return or remain in those regions, in their region, but also more likely to move out of Quebec than to move to Montreal. Students from Montreal are more likely to move out of Quebec than to move to Quebec's regions. And students who speak a language other than French or English are more likely to remain in Quebec than Anglophones. Remember, there are fewer of those students. The Anglophones are the larger group, but still a larger percentage of the allophones intend to remain. 16% of Anglophones, 12% of Francophones, and 8% of allophones intend to leave Quebec after graduation. Finally, the proportion of students who don't know where they will establish themselves tends to be substantial, and this leaves room for possibly effective interventions and encouraging them to remain in Quebec. Now, what you see here are the results of students who would choose to leave Quebec, the reasons that they would do that. What you see is that language proficiency for those students ranks very highly. So language proficiency here is probably a negative factor. These students might not be confident in their French. Also very high is the possibility of employment. So students who intend to leave Quebec seem to be doing so because they think employment opportunities are maybe more accessible. If I click to the next one, you'll see a contrast with the students who intend to remain in Quebec. Here you see possibility of employment is the third factor. So it's also high. So this is a crucial thing. If we want to encourage people to stay in Quebec, they have to have access to employment. But family and friends and being closer to home also.
2 minutes, Mr. Brown.
2 minutes, okay. Well, you'll see here that language proficiency is much lower. So these students tend not to be anxious about their French, and it doesn't really rank as highly as a factor. We can see here choice of location for work after studies, the green being intentions to stay in Montreal, blue in Quebec outside Montreal, and yellow outside of Quebec, and dark green, I do not know. So you'll see that Anglophones, 55% of them intend to work in Montreal, 11% in the regions of Quebec, and 16% are thinking of leaving, with 17% not knowing where they will be. Here you have the others, the allophones. 65% of them intend to stay in Montreal, and 8% each intend to leave Quebec or go to a region. You see that 12% of Francophones are intending to leave. Next slide is adequacy of written French cross-tabulated with main language. So the green are Anglophones, blue are Francophones, yellow are allophones, and the others, and the dark green is the total. So you can see that Anglophones, if you add up strongly agree and agree, you have 65% of them who feel that their written French is adequate. And among allophones, you have 66%, that's 26 plus 40. So it's comparable with some greater degree of confidence among allophones. We have, with the disagrees and strongly disagrees, the Anglophones outranking, of course, Francophones, but also allophones. And I'll just go to my final slide, where you see that confidence in spoken French is greater for all groups, including, of course, Francophones. But we have 81% of Anglophones thinking their spoken French is adequate, and 16% who feel that it's not. that 16% is very close to the 17% who indicate that language proficiency is a reason for leaving Quebec. So this gives you you can see this is figure 57. We have many, many figures with cross tabulations for permanent resident, whether it's in the regions or in Montreal, and with the address of the college they're attending, but I won't get into that. I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. Our next speaker is Nicholas Salter, who is the Executive Director of the Provincial Employment Roundtable, PERT. Mr. Salter.
Hi, how's it going? All right, I have some slides as well, so I am going to pull those up. Great. So yes, I'm the Executive Director of PERT, otherwise known as the Provincial Employment Roundtable. And I hope to cover two things today primarily. So unlike the previous presenters, I'm not going to dive into some original research, but one, I want to give you kind of a background about PERT, why we were created, the context in which we were created, and some important milestones along the way in PERT's development. The second thing I want to do is sort of lay out our research agenda. We're fairly new to the scene, and I want to make sure that you guys have a sense of what's to come from us in the next few months and years. So here on this first slide, you'll see an overview of PERT, very short overview. The key words here being that we're a nonprofit organization and that we're a multi-stakeholder initiative. And I'll explain what the multi-stakeholder means later. One thing, we're focused on addressing the employment and employability challenges facing Quebec's English-speaking community. So that's the primary focus of our organization and our mission. Now, what does that mean? What do we mean by employment and employability challenges? A lot of this has already been covered, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here, also knowing that I have a tendency to speak quickly and to spare our translator some pain. So same context that our previous speakers have sort of given as a context that sort of led to PERT's creation. So higher levels of unemployment for the English-speaking community, lower incomes, poor participation in the public service, migration out of province for English speakers. Certainly this is not an exhaustive list, but these are some four big employability and employment challenges that come to mind or are top of mind for us here at PERT. And it's in this context that PERT was created. So I'm just going to cover a couple of milestones and background into PERT's creation. PERT was initially a project of Yes Montreal. So in March 2019, Yes and Secretariat came together to work on the development of PERT. Throughout that summer, from May 2019 into October, a PERT steering committee was formed. There was surveys with community leaders, stakeholders in the English-speaking community, and all that culminated in a conference in November 2019. Mr. Skeete mentioned that conference part of his remarks, so closing the 12K gap. A pretty important conference, and a lot of inputs went into that conference, and data was collected from the participants. That data was ultimately published in a report that came out in May 2020. And I'll get back to this conference report as being a pretty pivotal part of our work later on in my remarks. In September 2020, after the success of the conference, the decision was made to create PERT and found it as its own organization. So PERT had its founding AGM in September 2020. The board of directors largely drew from the existing steering committee. They began the search for the executive director, which brought them to me, and I began in this role in January 2021. So a little over 2 months ago. PERT exists kind of due to two main things. So these are the two main pillars of PERT. The first being research. So PERT is really there to conduct policy research, develop a deeper understanding of the challenges and problems in the employability and employment landscape. As you've seen, some of our speakers have scoped those out already, and I mentioned some at the top of this presentation. We're also there to identify gaps in the data, improve the availability of information, ultimately getting a better sense of the problems and challenges. We're there to then develop solutions and make policy recommendations. The second piece of PERT's work is engagement, and this is where the multi-stakeholder piece comes in. So PERT is really a creation of different stakeholder groups, and those stakeholder groups being the Yes Montreals of the world, those community organizations that work in employability. Some of them are very specialized like Yes, some of them exist in the regions and do other activities, but do employment work as well. another one of our important or key stakeholder groups is the education sector, and the third is the private sector. So we exist to bring them together. The Roundtable is in our name for a reason, to foster an environment of engagement and collaboration. We also exist to mobilize resources and come up with solutions collectively, and to work with governments for the benefits of our stakeholders. Now, these arrows are there on purpose because ideally this is sort of a cycle where each activity or each of these pillars support each other, much in the way that pillars support the structure of a building, so that the engagement activities can feed the research and the research can feed the engagement. So I'm coming back to the PERTS conference, closing the 12K gap. That was in November 2019. That was a pretty pivotal and historic moment in this sort of area of research and for the community and the stakeholders that work in this space. There was 96 attendees at the conference, 50 organizations represented, including government, which is pretty important to have them there. Minister Boulet made the announcement about the creation of a consultative committee at that conference, which is again an important historic moment for the community. And what emerged from that was that report I mentioned, 39 recommendations across the short, medium, and long term, and 5 bigger kind of bucket policy areas that were identified. And so that's what I want to speak to a bit more, is those 5 areas, because I think they really start to set a roadmap for a research agenda for PERT. Those 5 areas are the following. So just to note here, the numbers in brackets in red relate to the number of recommendations in each area. So those should hopefully add up to 39, but it gives you a sense of some of the focus of the participants in the conference. Now, I frame these more as questions because at this point, it is still early days, and I think in some ways we have more questions than we have answers, though certainly that conference report gives us, as I mentioned already, a roadmap to focus our energies and our efforts. When it comes to employment programs, though, and funding, the big question is how can funding and programs become more flexible and equitable for organizations that serve English-speaking clientele. French second language training, another big one. Very clear that the community wants increased access, eligibility, a question of existing programs, but increased availability, and also one that meets the community's unique needs. When it comes to government, I think the big question is how can government adapt its policies and support the English-speaking community? How can government better consult the community? I mean, the Secretariat's creation and ongoing funding is really a major and important first step in this regard. But I think there's still more work to be done in this area. For employers, employers face some barriers, able to retain their employees, to train them, specifically French language comes up here again, and overcome some of the geographical barriers and costs that exist. And finally, the education system. So, how can the education system be expanded to support the regions, continuing development in the regions, training at a distance, et cetera, professional development of employment counselors, and how can we increase internships and sort of practical opportunities?
2 minutes, Mr. Stalter.
Thank you. For pathways to jobs for people graduating from our education system. So this is really the roadmap, the bigger picture for us here at PERT and what we are going to spend the next few months and years working on. But what's next for PERT on sort of the immediate horizon? So what we're up to these days, we're going to be publishing some research. Upcoming research is regional profiles and inventory of vocational education programs. That draws heavily on the 2016 census, or at least the regional profiles do, looking at employability across the various administrative regions of Quebec. Nothing particularly groundbreaking in this, but what's sort of unique is that this actually hasn't been done, and in some ways demonstrates that the need for an organization like PERT. What's also great is with the upcoming census will provide us with a good baseline of comparative data. We also need to mobilize our stakeholders, so that's continuing our roundtable discussions with the various stakeholder groups that I mentioned and getting them involved in the organization. We need to continue to build our research capacity and partnerships with the academic sector. We're currently hiring staff, and I'll mention more about that in a minute. And we have new practical research projects that we hope to announce soon. And going back again to that conference report, the 39 recommendations, quite a large chunk of work. And for us, we have to continue to prioritize the research agenda informed by our stakeholders and some of our internal analysis. So how can you get involved? Well, if this at all is interesting to you, my email is there. You can certainly reach out to me. Our website went live this week, which is quite exciting. So you can check that out, pertquebec.ca. We are currently hiring, so job listings are under the team page on our website. The conference report that I mentioned is available on the website, and I'm sure we could probably put this in the chat later. You can sign up for our newsletter, so when that new research comes out shortly, you can be the first to kind of read it and get access to those conclusions and that data. And we've set up our social media, so Twitter and LinkedIn are now active, and you can follow us there. So I'm looking forward to answering your questions later in the Q&A period, but that's pretty much it for me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Salter. And finally, our last speaker is Mr. William Floch, who is Assistant Secretary with the Secrétariat en relation avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise. I guess if we're looking for someone, an Anglophone who is a real-life Anglophone, who is a real-life public servant in Quebec, there we are with Mr. Floch. Mr. Floch?
Okay, thank you, Danielle. So thank you, and boy, I have to say, sitting and listening to the previous speakers, I come away very impressed. I knew, a fair bit about each of those projects, but seeing how some of the research is emerging, seeing some of the infrastructure that's being created and taking up its mandate, I find it very encouraging. I'll just say that to begin with, and. Christopher Skeete, in his preliminary remarks, spoke about a number of the orientations and strategy of the Secretariat. So I won't repeat that, except to say that one of our key mandates, in addition to liaison and providing support, advice to other government departments, is the requirement to develop research, to share research, to disseminate. So I'm going to do a little bit of that today, but I'll describe it as very much a work in progress, but also something that we're hopeful will be useful to many players, both out in the community sector, academia, and in government. So that's our intention with the work we're doing. Of course, we have quite an ambitious mandate, our Secretariat, so we cover really all sectors that may be important to English-speaking Quebecers. But I think it's fair to say that employability has been a major priority for the Secretariat since its creation. So I'm going to share with you then, so you can see on the map, we've got Quebec, we've got the administrative regions. In this case, they're broken down a little bit into Réseau Territorial de Service, which is a kind of a health construct, but useful because often the community is organized in that way. And Grant Meyer in the chat box raised a question about the 12,000 missing jobs, as it were. And just to explain that simply, the notion is that if we look at the 2016 census data, we see the unemployment rate for Francophones in Quebec is 8.9%. The unemployment rate for English speakers was at the, sorry, I reversed that, 8.9% for English speakers, 6.9% for Francophones. So a difference of 2 percentage points. And if we asked ourselves, well, how many more English speakers would have to be employed to reduce that gap and essentially to produce a 6.9% unemployment rate? And it comes to just over 12,000. So that's kind of I think a useful number to sort of hang our hat on. And the folks at Youth Employment Services who were involved as an incubator for what became PERT found that a useful indicator, I guess. So, and also it has the advantage that every 5 years the census will come out and we can measure to see whether that number has diminished. One would certainly hope over time that it can and that it will. So one of the other things I'll just mention, and this is kind of a bit of a research methodology point, we've also done a fair bit of analysis of census data and other types of data where we take the Francophone majority, for example, as a base, and we compare the characteristics of English speakers and try to see what the differences are. And then we can start to, dig a little deeper and try to find the explanations for why those differences may be present, but then also down the road start to develop the strategies. So I'm going to maybe, before I sort of launch into sharing some data with you, I'll mention one other thing is that obviously census data is really important. It has limitations, but nonetheless, it's a broadly based data collection done pretty much in the same way every 5 years. So you can measure progress over time and you can get a broad look at community characteristics. But of course, that's only one data source. It's also very interesting to look at, for example, the notion of institutional presence. So the idea of, are there English-speaking organizations and institutions that may be taking up the task of working on a particular dossier that is important to the vitality of the community. I think there's also, and this is very important in our view of the world at the Secretariat, there's also the notion of the other ministries and agencies in the government of Quebec and the organizations they fund. So the notion is that there's also within the Francophone majority in the mainstream population, there are institutions and organizations that are obviously playing a very important role. And it's worth pointing out here that the government of Quebec is quite, in my view, exemplary in this regard, is that we have a very long-standing and committed approach, which is to support the community sector, who in turn take on certain mandates and missions and make life better for the population on the ground. I guess that's the way I'd put it. And our analysis shows that there are 22 departments and organizations in government that offer community support programs. Altogether, there's about 70 programs, more than 5,000 beneficiaries, and a transfer of more than $1.1 billion annually. And that was pre-COVID, and during the COVID period, some of those amounts have increased. So the government of Quebec has a very strong commitment to working with the community sector to achieve its goals as a government, but also help the population achieve their goals. So our colleagues at the Ministère du Travail, Emploi et Sécurité Sociale, who run Emploi Québec is under their aegis, they have arguably 300 to 400 organizations that are service providers in the employability sector. So I'll come to them in a moment too, just to say that looking at basic characteristics of the population, trying to understand the employability challenge, then looking at on the ground who might be in the position to work with government to address those challenges. So I'm just going to add a layer here to the map. These colors, and I'll just explain it quickly, each of the polygons, each of the shapes represents an MRC, Municipalité Régionale de Comté, which is for the socioeconomic sector, a very important, I guess, geographic boundary set. Those regions are important. There's a lot of resources directed at the MRC level. The MRCs themselves, which are collections of municipalities, increasingly are playing a crucial role in economic development, cultural development, social development. So it's really very important organizing principle for Quebec government programs. The colors indicate that the dark red indicates that there's an important gap for English speakers in that territory. So essentially it compares the unemployment rate for the two populations. And if we see a dark red, it means that the unemployment rate is much higher for the English speaking community than it is for the Francophone community with whom it shares a territory. The kind of more beige color, I guess orangish, means that it's still higher, but not too much higher. And the dark green and the light green mean it's either lower or much lower. And so what stands out on this map clearly is that we have many regions of Quebec where there is a jobs gap, where the unemployment rate for English speakers is much higher than for Francophones. So that tells us something that, for example, we can't just say that it's localized in one region or another. We have to be prepared to develop a strategy and an approach that would mobilize actors across the province. And in that, we're very fortunate that through some previous work done mainly around the Access to Health dossier, but the Community Health and Social Services Network and what they call NPI, or Networking and Partnership Initiative organizations, have been active on the ground, trying to develop approaches to improve the situation of their population. And
2 minutes, Mr. Floch.
Okay, one of the key things that they do is they work on the notion of developing relationships and partnerships. So we've built on that, and we're intending to build on it further. So I'll just show you very quickly a couple of other data points then. These would be the organizations that are, and I'll just maybe go to one region, it doesn't matter, I'll pick one. So these yellow dots indicate the service providers I mentioned. So where are they, who are they, and the size of the dot, in fact, represents the amount of funding that they're given to carry out their services. So that gives us, we've got the population as a background, we've got the Francophone service providers, and then here I'm just going to add a small layer, which is the green stars that have shown up. Some might think they're the stars of the show, remains to be seen, but we certainly think so and hope so. Our strategy here, working closely with community organizations, would be to build on their existing work, their pre-existing work, to build partnerships and relationships with Francophone service providers, with government offices in their region, all towards the goal of having the particular needs and situation of English speakers better understood by the service provider, and to improve the offer of service to those populations. So in addition to some of the work that was discussed that PERT's going to be doing, some of the work that Celine Cooper shared a research project that she had done wearing one hat. She's wearing another hat now as the coordinator for the Consortium for post-secondary institutions, and we're looking forward to signing an agreement with them to help them work on pathways into the public service. So just I'll sum up by saying that the kind of inputs we've had from the community, both in consultations and in our own reading of data, tells us that for our employability strategy, making access to public sector jobs, that's an important dimension. Ensuring that service providers are better equipped to serve English speakers, that's another one. And that broad policy work and research by, for example, PERT, as well as drilling down and understanding better the whole notion of improving French language competencies for the workplace. So those are kind of some pretty important points in our strategy. But I thank you for the opportunity to share a bit of our data, and I look forward to our continuing discussion. And I just say in closing this part of it, congratulations on all of the folks who have already are quickly out of the gate and working to address these problems. Thank you.
We have a good half hour ahead of us for questions. I will maybe start myself with one question. And coming back to the general question I would like to ask everyone actually on the panel is, we've heard from Mr. Floch, we've heard from Mr. Skeete, there are strategies, there are policies that have been in place now, that have been also in place historically, yet what we've also heard is that there are some issues with respect to access to employment for Anglophones in Quebec. What is the real problem? Is the effectiveness of the policies that we've had in place before? Or is there a question of communication between the Anglophone community and the Quebec government? Where's the rub, so to speak? Anyone would like to try and answer that question?
I could jump in to start.
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Brown.
But it doesn't. The reason it's just to start is it doesn't really concern the Quebec government. I'd just like to draw attention to the fact that Corrections Canada, which is a federal agency, also has obligations to the linguistic minority in Quebec. And from my understanding is that Corrections Canada, only its employees in Quebec only represent about 2% of its, Anglophones only represent about 2% of its workforce, where we would expect it to be somewhere around 10% if were going to be representative. So I think some outreach needs to be done, and there are many federal corrections institutions in Quebec that are very good employers. So I think that's something we need to look at as well, but I'll let the other people address the issue of the provincial government.
Mr. Floch, you want to give it a try?
Yeah, I think in Celine's overview, which we're very pleased to receive because we think it gives a nice historical reminder of the progress or the lack of progress on this dossier. I think that notion of a definition gap is part of the explanation. There's also this notion of, I think, supply and demand. So at one level, and I think you yourself alluded in our informal conversation, that there is a tendency and a reflex. It's an easy path for English speakers graduating from Montreal or Bishops, English language institutions. A pathway into the Government of Canada is a fairly easy thing. It's not as obvious. So we do need to, in some ways, do some awareness building. I think we have to explain and underline, and I'll speak from personal experience, having spent 3 years living in Quebec City now in my last 3 years, I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And I think for young people, it might be a very exciting opportunity, which I don't think that we've we've sort of really sold that enough. But obviously, so there is the notion of supply. Like, are there young English speakers who are interested? Are there enough of them to explore a career in the public sector in Quebec? The other is the demand side, and one of the things that we've discovered is that the demand side is there. It's very real. In our dealings with the Secretariat Conseil de Trésor here in Quebec, as well as with managers of the Quebec Public Service in the regions, because we've done provincial tours where we've met with many of the senior people in various regions. In many employment categories, there's a real need. There's a real worry about attracting and retaining personnel. So there in fact is more of a demand currently than we might have seen in previous decades. So that may be promising, if you like. But if we can't connect the people who we could perhaps convince to be interested to where the jobs are, then I'm not sure that we're going to, make a lot of progress even with good intentions. And that's where, we're working closely now on an agreement potentially with the Consortium of post-secondary institutions to help them work on part of the problem. At our end, within the Secretariat, we've had discussions with the Secretary Conseil de Trésor to create a bilateral committee where we look at some of the more policy issues. But I'm not going to claim that we can snap our fingers and solve this problem. I think the 1981 appointment of Egan Chambers was something that the government of René Lévesque did. So, if we tried 40 years ago in a different political climate, and had mixed success or very little success, I would be, I think, overly ambitious to say we can solve it right away. But I think these are some of the steps that we need to take.
Thank you. Celine, Nicholas, you want to pipe in here? Nothing to add?
The only thing I would add, so prior to joining PERT, folks may not know this, I was at the Max Bell School of Public Policy. So that's a new public policy school at McGill University.
McGill.
I spent the last 3 years helping to sort of build and launch that school. And I think, we were very focused on the global stage and recruiting an international cohort of students. And, in some ways, we accomplished that. Half the students arriving were from sort of a variety of countries across the world. Half were Canadian, a mix of Quebecers and Canadians. But the focus certainly, I think I would say, having that experience, there's a gravitation towards Ottawa. And I do think that can be overcome with clearer communications, with a clear expression of interest from the Quebec government with recruitment efforts to let people know that they are welcome and in fact desired in the Quebec public service. But there are certainly some barriers in place and a natural sort of gravitation towards Ottawa that both happens on, I think, perhaps on the half of the institution, but also on the students. And so that's what I would just add here on top of Bill's excellent remarks.
Thank you. Celine?
No, I don't have anything else to add right now.
Okay, thank you. We have a number of questions. Sorry, yes, Mr. Brown?
Well, just a further remark on that. It's kind of anecdotal, but I think significant. I had a speaker from the Eastern Townships come into a class at John Abbott last year, or a year and a half ago, to talk about the environmental history of the St. Francois River. And when we asked the students if they knew where the Eastern Townships were, there wasn't a single student out on John Abbott on the West Island who knew what the Eastern Townships were. So that's interesting. I spent a certain amount of time in the townships, and I remember seeing some promotional literature for tourism in the townships, which was very effective, except that we're 1 hour away from Montreal, and there was not a single visible minority in this promotional material. And there are a significant number of visible minorities in Montreal and in the English-speaking community. So I think the efforts have to be made to educate people about the entire territory of Quebec and the fact that there are opportunities and beautiful places and interesting things. So that's anecdotal, but I think significant.
Thank you. We have a number of questions now from the participants. And I think this one is probably for you, Mr. Floch. Someone's questioning your 12,000 gap. He wonders about the methodological rigor of that figure. Maybe you want to address that. The person says, this doesn't suggest that I'm questioning there are differences in employment and participation rates between the general population and the English population, but I remain skeptical about the 12K gap. Maybe you want to speak to that.
Well, I'm not sure I understand the skepticism. I think it's a fairly straight up kind of mathematical comparison. Obviously, when one starts to think, okay, how do we bridge that gap, strategies based on that number, it has to be nuanced. For example, understanding where, you know, if we say compare the population, if we look at different characteristics, where they live, in which region, the age group, the educational attainment, whether they're a visible minority status. There obviously one needs to, and we've done that kind of work in the background to look at the various characteristics to ensure that we have a good understanding. It's a big number, a high level number that attracts attention. It is real, it's solid, but it doesn't in and of itself lead to obvious strategies. You then have to drill down and tailor your strategies. For example, are we looking at older workers? Are we looking at, although, for example, we've done some looking at the educational attainment, and it's true both for people at the higher end of educational attainment, that there are a fair number of people who have post-secondary degrees who are underemployed. And it's also true that at the lower end, those with very little educational attainment are underemployed. So, but we have some knowledge of that, and I think we can then develop community strategies on a regional basis that target where the gaps are.
Thank you. We have another question here, basically, which is about the data on Anglo-Quebecers who have left Quebec. Are there studies, the person asks, done on how many millennials have left Quebec, where they are now, and why they left, particularly anything that might include why they left on their in their own words? Does anyone have data on that?
Well, again, I'll jump in. There was some data presented by or prepared by the Conseil Exécutif under Couillard, based on data from 2011 that showed the likelihood of Anglophones remaining in Quebec, Anglophones born in Quebec remaining in Quebec by amount of education. So once you got up to the PhD level, a relatively small minority of people, Anglophones born in Quebec, would end up remaining in Quebec. The lower you went down, the more likely they would remain. So that was actually a very revealing study, especially when it was put into contrast with the rates of retention of Francophones by level of education. So that is available somewhere.
Yeah. We can certainly share that. That was work that I'd done previously, and I've published a few articles along those lines. But I would say, although that's more, it's based on census analysis, and the question about motivation, it's not covered by the census clearly. But I would say there that there's some studies, and I think Martin Girard of Canadian Heritage is on this call, but some previous work around perceptions and intentions along the lines a little bit of what Doug Brown has talked about with regard to the CEGEP level students. But the notion of without a doubt, socioeconomic status and socioeconomic sort of ambitions do explain a lot. That the upwardly mobile English speaker has become the outwardly mobile. So trying to provide opportunities, and the notion that there are openings both in sort of general society as well as in the Quebec Public Service, that's an important, how would I put it, message to be sent. In terms of the data about people's future intentions to stay or leave Quebec, there seemed to be quite a generational divide, that folks who were under 30, if they were planning to leave, their motivation tended to be for employment or education. People over 60, for example, tended to be, if they intended to leave, the motivation was often around rejoining family or going back to the region they come from perhaps, or rejoining the children who had left. Folks in the kind of middle age group, often they referred to sort of more political and feeling unwelcome. So it's really interesting to note that depending on the generation of people we're talking about, there could be quite different motivations. But without question, this notion of a sort of a selective out-migration is a problem for the English-speaking community. And when we compare it with other provincial populations or other linguistic groups in Canada, English-speaking Quebecers really stand out as being unable to retain the more highly educated members of their population, which represents a real challenge.
Thank you. There's a number of questions. Actually, someone is suggesting internships, Mr. Floch. Should there be more internships with the Quebec government, particularly with the Secretariat? Is there any opportunity for example, students who are interested in working for the Quebec Public Service to have internships with the Quebec government, or particularly with the Secretariat or any other departments in the Quebec Fonction publique du Québec?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting pathway. We're very close to finalizing an agreement with the Consortium of post-secondary institutions, who Celine Cooper is now wearing that hat, which will be part of their mandate will be to explore different kinds of internships that could be possible. We're also likely to involve an agreement with l'École nationale d'administration publique, who will work with the consortium and ourselves to explore the various pathways into the public service. But certainly internships are a very interesting opportunity. You know, I've got personal experience having been a manager previously where I had a number of interns and really benefited from their experience and felt like we gave them an opportunity. And even my own children have been involved with internships and to great advantage for their career. So I think it's definitely something to retain, something that we're looking at.
But since language might be an issue for some people, would the internships also include the possibility of training in French, for example?
I think most definitely that would be a factor. And, you know, in that regard, I'll just mention, it's not really covered here today, but Youth Employment Services, an excellent organization serving English speakers in the Greater Montreal region, has done a fair bit of work looking at how to build confidence and competency in the French language in the workplace. Part of what they've done, which I think is interesting and a kind of a new angle, is to say it's not just about the young person, the future employee, but it's also how the employer accompanies that person. So I think from that point of view, there's reflection and work to be done. And I think we can also look to some of the programs that exist currently in the government of Quebec around welcoming visible minorities, immigrants into the Quebec Public Service, because some of the challenges will be the same, and we can build on some of the approaches that are being successfully undertaken there.
Mm-hmm. Someone's mentioning that Dawson and the CEGEP in Gaspé have an exchange program to so that students become more familiar with the region, and those from the region get experience in the city. I don't know if that anyone that's how much of a program is it still very much alive, or was it historically happening, but it's not happening anymore? Does anyone know about this program? No.
Well, John Abbott also has one. Very few students take advantage of it, but some do. We also have exchanges that are possible with French CEGEPs like Gérard Gaudin. I'm sure that Dawson and Vanier have these as well.
Yeah.
I believe that Vanier College has a program currently with CEGEP de la Gaspésie, who have a small English stream. Their stream was facing numbers challenges and may have been forced to close. And Vanier had perhaps a surplus potentially of students. So they worked with something where some Vanier students were offered the opportunity to spend a semester or maybe even a year, I'm not sure, out in the Gaspé, to also an enrichment opportunity for them.
Yeah. There's a question here for Mr. Brown. Someone says here, Doug Brown mentioned apparent lack of knowledge of students in an English language college about realities of Quebec outside Montreal. My question, what role could the education system play in helping to build a sense of belonging with Quebec and possibly increase students' likeliness to stay in the, likelihood to stay in the province? That's a question for you, Mr. Brown, but I guess anyone else could try and answer that question. That's a very good question.
I really think regional internships at the CEGEP level, exchange programs at maybe all levels, travels to those regions, you have to see them to understand how attractive they are. And if students don't get out of Montreal and see them, they're not going to be engaged. That's all I have to say about that right now. I'm sure other people have thought about it.
Mr. Salter, is this something that PERT would like to work on or do more work towards achieving this kind of knowledge that perhaps some students in Montreal lack about the Quebec reality or the regions?
I think when it comes to the regions, what's really important, and I think is probably underappreciated, is there actually are English-speaking communities that exist throughout the regions of Quebec, and that's like an under sort of underrepresented or misunderstood reality. And you know, we have Kathy Brown on the board of our organization, the Regional Development Network, who's going to play a pivotal role in looking at employability and employment challenges at the provincial level across the regions. And I think English speakers understanding the importance of reasons of vitality of those English-speaking communities in the regions is important. And looking at strategies to ensure that they continue to thrive, it would be part of the work of PERT for sure into the future. And again, I hate to repeat what I said before, but I think there is a communications challenge, what I said before as it relates to the civil service, but I do believe there's a communications challenge here as well about educating and informing people about these English-speaking communities, and that you're not just going to the regions. I mean, again, being exposed to French in the regions would be advantageous for English speakers to build up their French capacity, but there are English speakers there as well. And I think that's an important fact that needs to be discovered by lots of English speakers, especially in the Montreal area.
Ms. Cooper, is this question on the radar screen of the consortium? Is this something that your consortium would be working toward, helping develop a better sense of what Quebec is for English-speaking students?
I mean, I think that it becomes a part of it. The consortium is mandated to research and address this brain drain issue, this question of retention and employment of English speakers who pass through our post-secondary institutions in Quebec, and to look at this issue and to ask questions about why it is that that people are leaving the province. So I think that's something that the consortium will be looking at. But again, just to sort of reiterate what the other speakers have said, I think it really is a matter of exposure. It's a matter of opportunities. So yes, I could imagine the consortium looking into that.
Thank you. Here's a question from a former graduate of the Masters in Public Policy and Public Administration program at Concordia. And she says that as a grad of that program, she was hired by the federal government in Ottawa. Many federal positions are now offered with the possibility of remote work, so you don't have to relocate to Ottawa. Would that not be an option, she asks, for the Quebec Public Service so that Anglos outside of Quebec City would not need to relocate? That's an interesting question. Mr. Floch, you might want to address that.
Well, it's very interesting, out of, let's face it, the silver lining of the COVID period is that we may reinvent a lot of things, that we may see things differently. As a personal anecdote, I'll say that, and it's kind of bizarre to say, but between 1990 and 2002, I worked virtually from Quebec's Eastern Townships for a department in Gatineau. So I was, how would I put it, an early adopter of telework. So I'm convinced it can work. I have no problem with it. I would say that the federal government, because I worked there for many years, I've now been in the government of Quebec for 3.5 years, probably had a little bit of a more open attitude towards telework 5 years ago. But I think that this experience of the pandemic has really demonstrated that that we can look at work in a different way. And we are getting indications within the government of Quebec that that we may, our whole policy and approach to telework, we may not go back to the way it was previously. One other observation is that there's also a strong move with the current government to, in some ways, decentralize the Quebec Public Service so that reduce the concentration on Quebec City, but also to a certain extent Montreal, and have more positions be out in the regions. So that also does present some opportunities, I think. So the combination of telework and regionalization do mean that the current situation may be changing, and that in that change there may be opportunities.
And I'd like just to build here on Mr. Floch's comments. And I'd hoped to mention this before, but so if you remove that geographic barrier, that piece of the expression that you have to migrate to Quebec City, that's one piece of the puzzle. But I do want to emphasize that the second piece of the puzzle would be French language training, particularly as it relates to people coming out of those type of programs, whether it's providing them with an internship, an opportunity to improve their confidence. We really need to figure out how we can provide people with the ability to perhaps improve their written French or their ability to speak French, and understand how we can do that in an effective way to give them the confidence to go into the civil service. And that would be on on the supply side in terms of good grads who can speak French competently and participate and contribute to the civil service. Especially if you're removing those geographic barriers, I think that French language piece is pretty predominant as a sort of next barrier that needs to be overcome as well and better understood.
Celine, you're nodding. Did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, no, just I guess to build on that, it's something that we've had conversations about at the consortium. So this question of what can our post-secondary institutions do to better prepare our students with a level of French, a quality of French that is more oriented toward the job market, to a career environment. We realize that many of the programs that we have in French are they're a little bit more traditional. It's about grammar, it's about memorization, and that doesn't necessarily translate to the job market and when you're actually operating in a career environment. So we've been talking about sort of doing a scan of the kinds of ways that we prepare our students, and maybe is there a better way that we can approach our curriculum in the future that makes it more oriented toward employment. So those conversations are going on.
Okay, thank you. We might have the time for one more question, and that's someone who says, for the federal public service, you can take the aptitude test in either official language. I don't believe you can take the Quebec public service test in English. Can someone confirm this? I am referring to tests that are unrelated to language competency. And if this is so, why shouldn't English speakers be given the opportunity to write aptitude tests in English? Mr. Floch, you know about this, or how does it work?
Well, I'll see if maybe our newly anointed expert, Celine, if you can speak to that, because that's certainly something that we will be asking the consortium to dive in and in some ways demystify all of those questions. So I don't know, Celine, if you want to tackle that one, but to my knowledge, the reading is correct. I don't know if my colleague Olivier Chamberlain is on the line. If he is, maybe he could comment in the chat box.
So, if I may, before Celine, someone adds related to that question. As English-speaking youth, our bilingualism feels more valued by the federal government than the provincial governments. At the federal government, there are bilingual bonuses. Not sure if the same is offered at the Quebec government.
Yeah, I can speak to that. There are no bilingual bonuses.
No. Okay. Celine, you were going to say
no,
something.
I mean, this again is something that we found in a lot of our research, and I think that a lot of people know anecdotally that often English speakers in Quebec don't have confidence in the level of their French. They don't feel that it's adequate to work here in the province, but the level of French that they do have is considered a real asset in other parts of Canada and other parts of the world. So yes, that's an issue, and I think again that's something that we need to look at when giving people opportunities to work in a French environment, whether it's through internships or opportunities to build their confidence. And opportunities, I think, to learn French on the job and know that it doesn't have to be perfect, but that it's a process.
I just want to read a comment from actually one of my students who's participating in this webinar, and she says, even more specifically, a question already posed: can a relationship be made between the parts of the educational curriculum of secondary English institutions centered on Quebec history with that of Quebec-born English speakers' sense of belonging? Anecdotally, she says, I have learned about Quebec's culture and history, and in particular its nationalistic nature, more so throughout my chosen program of study in university rather than through secondary education in Quebec. Maybe we can leave it at that, and or anyone who care to comment on this final statement from one of our students.
If I could, I won't speak to the school, the secondary school curriculum, but I will say that in our consultations, we heard about that issue around sense of belonging. So, for example, the sense of do you have a good future in Quebec is one of the factors that may include invite people to consider leaving. But also, do you feel a sense of belonging? Do you feel accepted? Do you identify with Quebec? So, the Secretary, we're working with a network of organizations. Again, Lorraine O'Donnell QUESCREN is our partner, but groups like the English Language Arts Network, Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network, Seniors Action Quebec, Youth for Youth, Black Community Resource Center, and Learn Quebec hope I haven't forgotten anybody, but they're working collectively with us on a sense of belonging project to try to reinforce a positive identity of English-speaking Quebecers, to also remove that factor, which, like, to in a sense, confirm their identity and their sense of pride in being an English-speaking Quebecer. And by the way, at the Secretariat, we don't use the word Anglophone very much. We refer Québécois d'expression anglaise. So it's the notion of their Québécois. There's no question. D'expression anglaise is a part of their identity tag, but they're not les anglophones, but you know, that could become les autres. Anyway, so thank you.
Good point. Thank you very much. We have come to the end of our time. I'm sorry for those questions that we don't have the time to address. I want to thank everyone for this very informative and thoughtful talk and for all your interventions. I will then give the talking stick back to Lorraine O'Donnell with her closing remarks. Lorraine?
Thanks, Danielle. Just some thanks to express. First of all, of course, to our speakers and the audience members for having a worthwhile discussion on such an important topic, crucial to the vitality of English-speaking Quebec. Thank you to Hugh Maynard of Quanglo for tech support and to the interpreter, who I'm sure struggled to keep up. Thank you to Anna Hunt and Anna Gomez, our event organizers. And finally, to our sponsors, the Secretariat aux Relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise, the Department of Canadian Heritage, Canadian Institute for Research on Linguistic Minorities, and ongoing support for QUESCREN from Concordia University. And just a final comment, Anna Hunt will be posting in the chat an online evaluation form for this event, and she will also resend that link after the event. So we would ask you to fill it out, please, to help us plan for further events. Finally, of course, thank you to our moderator, Dr. Salée, for keeping everyone on time and keeping the discussion moving. Thanks very much.
I just may want to add, Lorraine, I think Anna Hunt put a number, or I think Patrick as well put a number of references to some documents in the chat. So if you want to stick around a little bit, everyone can see those references, I think. So, yeah.
I can ask Anna, we can preserve those from the chat and send those out with our follow-up email.
Perfect. Well,
thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.
Thank you.